Hi, everybody. So today's session is called Writing Across Cultures, and it's really about difference. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I know that in the little brief blurb about what the discussion is going to be about, it's about bias, appropriation, and then best practices for discussing and writing about difference. And I know that that seems like very vague and very general, but we're going to break it all down. So I'm going to try and keep everything sort of running on time today. So first, what I thought I would do is just introduce myself. I am not Kim Petaway, as my little name thing says on the bottom there. I'm Charlotte Gill, and I am a mentor. I've been in the King's program for a couple of years now. And then I am, sorry, my internet connection is a little bit unstable, I can see. But I'm just going to continue. I have been in the program for a couple of years as a mentor, and really I'm not any kind of expert on these matters of difference and diversity or inclusion. I'm really just a student. These are the kind of things that are really interesting to me. They show up on my radar. I read about it quite a bit. I'm a biracial writer. My dad is Indian and my mother is English. So these are the kinds of things that are really interesting to me. Cooper.
Hi, I'm Cooper Lee Bombardier, and I am a new mentor to the program and was mentor apprentice last year. And as a queer and trans writer, I grapple with these issues a lot through writing, but also in looking at my position walking through the world as a white man. So I too am a student of these issues, and always trying to think through and learn and expand my knowledge base. I also work as an editor, and so these are things that I'm bringing to the page too when I'm working with clients in terms of how sexism, potentially racist tropes, things like that appear in work, and how to shift it, how to think through it in terms of how it could land on a person from an identity that's not ours. So I'm excited to talk about this stuff. I love talking about this stuff, even though it's not easy, but I think it's really important work.
Ayelet.
Hi everyone, I'm Ayelet. I feel like I can echo some of the things you both said. First, that I am not an expert. I'm learning a lot every day. I find myself struggling with these questions all the time, but I do think it's really important to talk about them and tackle them and try. I think that's the operative word here, to try to make sense of it. And I feel like I had something else to say, but now I don't remember what that is. So that's it, I guess. Really, really glad to be here.
Wanda.
Hi, everyone. I'm Wanda Taylor, and of course, one of the mentors in the program. I started in 2018 as a mentor apprentice, actually the first mentor apprentice that King's had. And part of the reason why they decided to do that was because they wanted to bring in more diversity into the program, and this was a way to do that. So I was happy to be the first apprentice, and also now still being in the program. I think this is an important and necessary topic, and just like everyone else has said, there are no experts when it comes to talking about cross cultures. We're always learning, things are continually changing. We bring in our own experiences. Also, just like Cooper, I do editing as well, and I find a lot of times, especially when I'm working with people who are trying to write across cultures, a lot of times our personal bias seeps into the writing, and when you don't recognize that, that's when you can get yourself in trouble. So I'm really happy that this is happening, and I'm really glad that Ayelet brought this to the table, and I think it'll be helpful for students. So I'm glad that we're doing this.
Okay, so we're going to start talking about bias. And last year we had a guest speaker by the name of Jordan Ginsburg, who's a senior editor at Hazlitt and Strange Light. And he said one thing at the very start of his talk. He said, I have blind spots, but I don't necessarily know what's in them. And that seemed to be like a really good nutshell explanation of what bias is. And in the dictionary, all that means is to weigh in favor of or against an idea or thing often in a way that is prejudicial or unfair. And with bias in particular, I feel like it's really important to kind of think about and talk about these things. Number one, because there aren't any rules. There's, you know, it's not like Moses came down from the mountain and gave us these tablets and these are the rules we're going to work with. I think it can also be extremely important for creative nonfiction writers because this sort of stuff seeps into every pore of one's writing. You can do a book proposal and angle it in slightly the wrong way, and it can also filter into even at the sentence level. And I feel like it can have really quite important effects for a writer as they move into their careers with a book project. So I think it's important to look at bias. And I think sometimes it can be really difficult for us in the arts to talk about these things because it feels somehow like a moral failing to talk about it. But I think that scientists have a really good way of looking at it. Like they look at bias as something that they have to examine and to pick apart and to understand in order to get the best results. So it's not so much like a moral failing, it's more just like a systematic error. So if we can find out what our systematic errors are, then maybe we can get ourselves on the right track. So let's start with you, Wanda. What does bias mean to you? What does it look like? And how can we begin to look at it?
Yeah, the thing about bias is that it's happening when we're not recognizing that it's happening. It's happening in our everyday lives. We pick up these ideals about things. And I think getting to the root of your bias is figuring out, where did that come from? Why do I think this group of people acts like that? Or why do I think this certain type of person is going to be in a certain way? Looking at where that comes from without, you're not trying to blame or say, oh, someone told me or whatever, but looking at you personally, why did you take that in as this is going to be my truth? Or why did you take that in as it's okay to think this way? Like really examining yourself. So I think for me, bias is an inward thing. It's what you pick up, what you choose to accept, and recognizing that. And for me, we all carry certain biases about, everything or anything. But I think the main point of that is recognizing that I need to stop and figure out where that bias comes from and why I think that's true, and how that can be dangerous if you project that bias on someone else.
Ayelet.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I mentioned to you that I'm reading a book titled White Fragility right now. And that's one of the things she talks about there is that for people, they immediately think of people who are, may say something racist or ableist or, other kind of biases. And they think that it comes from a conscious, mean place necessarily. And when they associate racist behavior with that, they immediately go like, no, that can't be me, because I'm a good person and I mean well. And yet we still all have biases. And I've came face to face with my own biases every now and then. And I'm always like, first stunned when I realize, I'm like, wait a second, was that a fat phobic thought that I just had in my mind? So recognizing that, it's like listening to it and examining it. I think that's what really separates people who are, racist or ableist or, or discriminatory in some way, to people who care, people who are trying to make a difference, or people who are trying to change that first within themselves. So yeah, it's always an interesting thing for me first when I come face to face in my own life. So I really like what you said, like a systematic error rather than a moral thing, because when you attach morality to it and you think like, no, I'm a bad person, like the binary of good and bad, that's when it gets really hard to examine, right? You don't want to examine it. It's good or it's bad. So yeah.
Cooper.
Yeah, I really like that idea of looking at it more scientifically and taking some of the personal out of it, because I think that's where a lot of us get kind of stuck. Like if I'm a good person and I'm nice to people, then this doesn't apply to me. and thinking about it more as taking an active stance of like, this is something I'm gonna do an editorial pass of my manuscript, particularly for bias. I'm going to look at how I'm representing others, how I'm talking about bodies, how I'm talking about ability, how I'm talking about people different from me. And it's really difficult. I think the idea of bias makes it sound like it's something we're choosing to do, but that sort of implicit bias where it's something about, I think, for some people, for some of us, I know for me, it's those mental shortcuts of what I think I'm saying versus what I've actually put down on the page. And then having to go back and look and sort of unpack, like, did I say this as intentionally as I want to say it? Did I think through how this could be read by somebody different from me in any way? Why am I telling this story? You know, and I recently read How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, and he was talking about there being no neutral, right? That something's either racist or anti-racist, that it's, you know, the sort of choosing to be active about something, like there's not really a positionality of not engaging with it. And I think that's a challenge that people from dominant social identities can take up as a job. As a white person, it's something I want to take up as my work, even though I'm going to screw it up. I have made mistakes. I've made stupid, terrible mistakes in my effort of trying to not be racist, of trying to be anti-racist, for example. However, I still feel like it's work that I need to keep doing. I need to keep working at. And so making it active, making it intentional, getting outside eyes to read my work, you know, around specific things that I might not be conscious of, all of that I think is helpful.
Thank you. Wanda, I want to ask you about one of the presentations that you gave at one of the residencies we had in former years. In particular, I want to ask you about this kind of flat earth fallacy, you know, the idea that everybody's experience is exactly the same. And the example that you gave, I believe it was at the New York residency, was about a Black community in Nova Scotia called Africville, which was bulldozed in the 60s. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? You're mute.
Yeah, so first I want to say about that, you know, we tend to do that a lot. So if I had another Black woman standing beside me, the automatic assumption is that our experiences are the same because we share the same race. But me as a sixth generation Canadian would have an experience that would be entirely different from a Black immigrant Muslim woman or a Black lesbian woman. And sometimes we forget that it's like an onion, there's multi-layers to all of us. We're not monolithic. We share the same race. We have some historical experiences that are the same, but we're very different. And then sometimes, and in my personal experience, we get labeled or accused or stereotyped in a certain way because we share the same race. And so the example of Africville was a community, a Black community in Halifax. And in the 60s, the government decided that, you know, they were on a prime piece of land right on the Bedford Basin. And the government wanted to develop that land. But of course, these people had paid for their land. They owned their houses. They spent decades fighting the government just to get water and sewer through there, which they didn't have. And because they didn't have water and sewer, the government started labeling them as slums, like that they were living in slums. And they didn't have garbage pickup. So then, you know, there was garbage nearby. And so they started being called a slum. And this is what the government used to say, we need to get rid of these people. We need to get rid of this slum. It's an eyesore, instead of giving the people the services that they were paying for. So as people resisted and said, no, we don't want to give up our land, and part of it too is that some people were not educated. They didn't understand about the value of their land. And some of them were forced to sell their land for like $200. And those who refused, they were forced off of the land. And those couple people that were left behind The government came. It was in the middle of the night. They bulldozed the whole community. There's photographs and video of them just bulldozing the houses down. They literally picked one man up. He was a senior citizen. Literally picked him up into the bulldozer to take him off of his property. And then they built low-income social housing in downtown Halifax, and this is where they relocated those people. Now, cut to decades later, you have people writing about the area, so Uniacke Square and Mulgrave Park. You have people writing about this area with stereotypes like it's full of drug dealers, the women are prostitutes or just ghetto rats, or and all this stuff, but without looking at the background of how those people got there. They went from owning their own land to never ever owning the social housing that they live in, which had asbestos and other problems. But they're seen as an eyesore in that downtown, like it was their fault. Like, go get a job, go build yourself up. But they were already appropriated out of their land that they had. So people forget to look at historical experiences and other experiences that people have. They think, okay, so all Black people are lazy, all black guys are drug dealers or thugs, and we get these stereotypes, and people are visually looking at stuff that they think is what's happening without going behind that and seeing what that story is behind that. So that was the example I gave about that, and especially when we do that in our writing, and if you look at some of the things that have been written about Africville and about Uniacke Square and about the people who live there, you could see how those stereotypes creep in and how harmful it is to an entire community.
Thank you. This kind of relates to something I want to ask you about, Cooper. You have written about and talked about as well, the liberal perception fallacy. Do you want to mention that briefly?
Yes. Can I pause for 1 second?
Yes. Okay, Ayelet, maybe I'll come to you on this.
Yes, hi.
Maybe I'll come to you on this. So you have written about the, what is it like to write from a minority point of view when we are sort of faced with biases kind of flying everywhere? What does that mean when you're writing from a point of view that is considered minority when there is a majority point of view? And I think I'm also going to come back to this when we talk about workshopping and how writing is discussed, because that's also related there.
Yeah. So when I started writing, I didn't actually think that I could write at all about my community because I haven't seen it represented in literature, which I think is something all of you can relate to. When you don't see yourself in literature, you think you don't have a right to exist in literature. So for a while there, I actually pushed it away, and I thought, like, no, this is not the kind of stories I'm going to tell. And then when I finally did decide that I'm going to take the leap and try to tell stories about a community that almost nothing was written about, I came across first the idea that I'm writing to a majority that is not familiar with it. And I feel like it's all mixed in my head. I know we're trying to keep it apart, but it's a little bit hard to do because I was also an MFA student at the time. And that's the part that I wanted to mention in the beginning, that I'm not only an MFA mentor, I was also a student, and I was the only student in my entire cohort that was of color and it was of a marginalized community in the entire cohort. So I came across the kind of feedback that made me feel like misunderstood. People the names were hard to pronounce. We don't understand these foreign words. What do you mean she's Yemeni, but she's also Jewish, but looks like she's Indian? We don't understand. Like, it's the most confusing thing in the world. I'm like, try. We're back to that word. Come on, just try. So I actually fell into this writer's block where I felt like I just didn't want to do it. It was too hard, and I tried really, really hard to be something I'm not. I tried to cater to what I thought was the Canadian literary conventions. And of course that made me miserable because it was not my truth. So, you know, I was filled with the sense of self-betrayal, and it was a really bad time. And only when I decided, and I think it's important to mention how I got there, for me to find a way to actually tell my stories, it required reading only writers of color for an entire year. That's what I had to do. And when I did that, I still get emotional just talking about that. It's just like my world expanded in such a major way. And not just, it wasn't just that I could see that you could have all these different perspectives in literature. I could also see that you can tell stories in different ways, because I strongly believe that where you're from also affects your style, you know, and that, I think, what I bumped against in the writing workshop, I'm going back to there, that is so, you know, traditionally white. I wasn't writing in a way that they understood more than just, it wasn't just the content, it was beyond that. So when I did that, when I opened my world of reading, I started to believe that I can tell my story. And one of the ways that I decided to do it was by not apologizing, and by not catering, and by not being overly didactic, and giving the reader some credit, you know, that they can later on do their own, you know, further education, and that they're smart, that readers are intelligent. So I, for example, I don't italicize, you know, because I don't want to draw attention to the foreignness of the words in my text. And I can talk so much about it, so I probably should stop. But that's my journey in a nutshell, of writing from a minority point of view.
I think we're going to come back to this at the end, so it's
okay.
a very good point.
Okay.
Cooper.
Hey, sorry about that. I wanted to pull up the quote here because I feel like instead of reinventing the wheel, I learned this notion of the liberal perception fallacy from the book Writing the Other by Nisi Shawl and Cynthia Ward. They are primarily like sci-fi speculative fiction writers. But this little book, it's just a little slim book. It's so warm and inviting and so great, and I recommend everybody get it if you haven't already gotten a copy of it. So the liberal perception fallacy is when a person, often but not always a liberal, decides that because it is bad to judge people, and I add in by their membership in a category, it therefore must be bad to notice there are any differences between groups or categories of people, or between people who are members of different groups. Of course, it's fine to notice that there are innumerable differences between groups of people, with indisputable differences marking them from one another. And why I was really drawn to that was kind of going off of what Audre Lorde said about, like in 1980, she wrote about how it's not our differences that stand between us, but our inability to recognize those differences. And so, so kind of on the maybe another end of the spectrum from like somebody being blatantly racist or something, there's, you know, maybe over here there's you know, like the white liberal fallacy of I can't ever say anything about differences between people because that's wrong. Or instead of just sort of, I think, leaning into the questions of what do I know or don't know about these differences between me and somebody who's different than me. And so that sort of, I think, kind of ties into a little bit what Ayelet was saying about sort of how MFA workshops are often led to, you know, we're, you know, kind of shaping people towards this hegemony of this sort of beige, white, like bland, quote unquote universality that is nothing to do with anyone's lives, but there's this sort of imagined thing that we should go towards. And if we don't respectfully, I think, you know, allow differences to come forward in the page, and we're sort of homogenizing and erasing difference. And difference isn't the problem. It's how we assign value to difference.
Okay, so I think we're going to move on to our next topic, which is all about appropriation. And I say appropriation, but I think really it's kind of a very large basket of ideas. And I know we can't possibly touch on them all, but maybe we can just sort of capture a few. And then we can follow up once residency starts during some of the live Q&As and sessions that we're going to have then. I want to mention another kind of bias or fallacy, if you will. This is totally unscientific. I don't even know if it has a name. But it's this idea that a blank page is a blank page and I can write whatever I want. I think that in some ways, yes, that's absolutely true, but in other ways it has limits. So I'm hoping maybe we can talk about how we begin to write about others, how we even write about ourselves. And I don't mean this necessarily from the point of view of every kind of writing, because I think fiction has its own topics when this is concerned, but specifically how it relates to creative nonfiction. Because even if you're writing in the first person, you can probably go like 3 pages before you will mention a he, she, or a they. So hopefully we can talk about that. So the dictionary definition of appropriation is the borrowing of cultural tropes from a minority culture by members of a dominant culture. And I think probably the most egregious example that I could possibly think of would be a Pocahontas Halloween costume. But then from there, things get a little more subtle and they get more complex. And I'm hoping maybe we can unpack that a little bit. So partially it's who we write about, and then it's also who we fail to address in our writing. I also consider that to be an issue when it comes to appropriation as well. So Ayelet, do you want to talk about how appropriation can show up in a writer's life, how it can show up when we talk about writing?
First of all, I was thinking about what you said. I'm still not sure that I know how to answer this question, but you said, you know, about the blank page, now it has limits. And I was thinking to myself, no, you can write absolutely whatever you want. And often you can even publish those things. But what you can't is to expect that you're not going to be called on it. And I think that's that's the issue here. That some people, you know, some famous authors as well, I'm sure there's a few examples that I can think of right now, who have written about other cultures, but then were, you know, upset that they were called on it. And you would be called on anything, you know, if you don't do it well. That's the whole idea of being a writer, you know. If your research is lacking, you're going to be called on it. If your, you know, writing is not very good, maybe the review is not going to be great. And if you appropriate a culture and you write about it poorly, then yeah, this is just a part of the deal. So I think that it's important to distinguish between the two, because often people say like, oh, now I can't write about anything. No, you can actually write about whatever you want. The question is, will it be published? And if it is published, will you be called on it? So that's an important distinction. And as for your question, I am now unsure what it was already.
Appropriation, how does it show up in a writer's life? And
okay,
I
so
think
in creative, yeah, go ahead.
I think it can be really kind of a pressing issue for writers who have book proposals, because oftentimes if they're kind of cast or angled in a way that is not carefully thought through, they can be quietly rejected and the writer never figures out why. So how can we begin to, if we need to write about other cultures or other cultural identities, how can we do it well?
Well, so I think the first thing, because I have had students who wrote about other cultures and did it well. And I think the first thing is to actually, I'm always worried if the student isn't worried or if the writer isn't worried. If they just go about it with no awareness of it, that is the first problem. But if they're aware, if they're concerned, if it's something that, you know, like one of my students it came up almost every time. You know, is it okay that I'm doing this? Is it, do I have the right to tell that story? and ultimately, I not that I am any authority. Some people may disagree. That's again a part of the deal. But I thought that he did a good job, and and he was actually given permission to tell the story. But yeah, so it's that it's caring about it, worrying about it, being aware that I'm doing it. And I go back to what Alicia Elliott said in her essay about seeing and being seen, about writing with love, which is, and writing with love and writing with goodness about a culture. So yeah, these are some of the thoughts that I have about that.
Wanda?
So I think a lot of it too goes to motivation. First of all, the whole cultural appropriation debate is a hot topic, because I think, like you said, you have people on that spectrum of I can write whatever I want. And then you have people on the other far end of the spectrum who say everything is cultural appropriation if you write about something that's not your culture, and then everything in between. But I think that, particularly if you are writing about a culture that isn't your own, you have to ask yourself, what's my motivation for writing that? If you're trying to tell a compelling story and you do that with thought, and you actually take the time to invest in that community that you're writing about, and not just writing about what you think that community is about, but take the time to understand that community. You couldn't possibly know some of the nuances of that community unless you spent time or talked to people from the community, or delved into some of the things that they deal with on a daily basis. So being thoughtful about it, putting in the time to do the work and do the research, and not thinking you already know everything about that culture. And also asking yourself the question, is anything I'm writing or my actions in writing so, is that going to offend, hurt, betray anybody in any way? And then looking over what you've done already to make sure that you aren't taking things from that culture or misrepresenting it in any kind of way. And that's head work, and that's heart work. And if your heart is in it, readers will feel that. Of course, just like Ayelet said, you're going to get people who are going to say, you're going to get critics to say you had no right to do that. And I'm just going to use myself as an example. I did 3 years of research on the Nova Scotia Home for Colored Children, which was an orphanage built in the 1920s, because Black children at that time weren't allowed in mainstream orphanages, so they built it. And it ended up being a house of horrors for those children. And so I went around and interviewed adult survivors. They sued the government, won a $3 million class action suit. And I had 2 family members, which I didn't know at the time, that were in that home who also suffered abuse. So I had a connection in that way, but I didn't come at it from that angle. I came at it as a social worker who was writing about how could these social workers dump these children there and leave them and never come back to make sure they were okay. And then it ended up, I had family that experienced it too. But there were even some survivors from that home who said, you had no right to write our story. Why did you do that? You didn't experience that. And so it's not just, and I think cultural appropriation, there was a culture within that home and within that community. And just because it was a Black orphanage and I was a Black person, I didn't automatically assume I had the right to write that story. I took the time. I took deliberate time, 3 years of going across Canada, meeting these people, spending time with the organization. But again, as Ayelet said, and I agree totally, you're still going to have those people who say, why did you write that? What was your motivation? But at least I was able to answer that. And I was able to say that, yes, I put in the work and I did what I needed to do to tell that story.
Yeah, I feel like these are very difficult lines to walk when we're writers. And a lot can be gained by hashing it out and discussing, what the pros and cons are. But I think probably, yeah, at the end of the day, you just have to write it, do your homework, right, as best as you can, and then take the heat or the thanks for having written what you wrote. So I have an example as well. I wrote Eating Dirt, which is a tree planting memoir, and it's got a lot of environmental history, logging history in British Columbia and Canada. And as I was doing the research, it became clear to me that this story was intimately tied to the First Nations people of this country, and that it was also tied to colonialism. But I felt very apprehensive about telling that part of the story, and I really sort of pared back quite a bit. I could have written a lot more about it. And then when the book was published, I got a couple of letters from people who are of Indigenous descent, and they said, you know, this is really the heart of the issue. And in the paperback edition, we made some corrections, but it's still one of my big regrets, being conservative on that front.
Yeah.
Cooper, you talk about, I mean, I think we all talk about this, the importance of it, but you talk about the importance of subjective positioning and writing about where you're coming from in order to acknowledge that, you know, we have a perspective and it's not, you know, that sort of omniscient journalist voice. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think that's important. You know, for me, it's something I've been exploring, trying to bring into my own work of, you know, acknowledging my limitations, acknowledging my social location, where I'm coming from. I think a lot about this idea of the marked state versus the unmarked state, and where the usually white, male, middle class, Western, educated, able-bodied narrator goes literally unremarked, right? That person is not named on the page, and then anyone different from that becomes the other. And I think it's important to kind of think about, you know, the stories that you all just shared. You know, that the word author is contained in the word authority, right? So this idea that the person who writes the story does take either a perceived or real position of power. And you know, even if somebody has a real investment or connection to a story, like Wanda's example, that there are those who aren't writers who feel that their story has maybe been written by somebody else, and that's just gonna happen. You know, it's gonna come up in our families, like, wait, you told this family's story, that's not your story to tell, or like, or the person who writes it kind of, it kind of puts a stake in the dirt of like, I'm claiming this, or I'm claiming myself as the authority. Whether we feel like we're doing that or not, I think it's like a power differential to kind of consider in terms of how other people are going to connect with the work or feel like it's been taken from them or whatever. And I think, you know, with your example of not wanting to write about the issue of or not wanting to speak as an authority on the issue of First Nations relationship to logging and or to the environmental issues of the book, like, I think acknowledging that, you know, is, I think it's fair to say, like, this is a part of the story that is important, but maybe like beyond the scope of my ability to tell, or whatever, to I think acknowledge questions, acknowledge limitations of expertise, to talk about why it is that you feel like you're the right person to tell this story. A non-literary example that I think is kind of neat to look at is the recent documentary that Ellen Page made about Ingrid Waldron's book, There's Something in the Water, about environmental racism in Nova Scotia. And, you know, she, I think, used her platform as a white person to get a story told. But I notice in the documentary that she doesn't center herself. Like, you very rarely even see her face in the documentary, and the voices of the people who are directly impacted and who are directly leading are given center stage. So I thought that was kind of interesting to look at in terms of how, you know, she, in the early part of the film, named why, you know, she's from here, she's from Halifax, and these are communities that her family have grown up in, and, you know, she explained her connection to the issue, but then she decentered herself, which I thought was interesting, an interesting way to look at it. I'll just stop there, sorry.
Does anyone have any last thoughts about that? I know it's really big and we can't possibly grab everything there is to talk about. Before we move on to how we begin to discuss difference and how we begin to have these discussions with each other without it leading to World War III. Okay, let's move on then. Now, I know that residency in person is canceled this year, and in many ways we'll have a completely different workshop experience. But in a way, I think the workshop is kind of a microcosm for this public space that writers live in. Once we have books published, or even before, we're always communicating with each other online and in person with other writers when we're not in the midst of a pandemic. So I do think it's this nice little microcosm for the kinds of things that writers talk about when it comes to bias, appropriation, difference, etc. It's also kind of, to me anyway, this is a completely personal opinion, it's also kind of a special space. The workshop, it's this place where we walk in with a sense of trust and kindness because we're being vulnerable with each other, sometimes very vulnerable. So it is the kind of space where we need to be honest, but we also have to be a little bit kind as well. So my own personal thinking, and I would welcome a debate on this, is that if I can try as a facilitator of a workshop to kind of de-weaponize the language of difference, I will usually try to do that. Because when we bring out phrases like white privilege, for example, oftentimes that's used as kind of shorthand for very complex ideas. And then things will devolve very quickly into like a crisis of oversimplification where, you know, one person is good and one person is bad, when really I think there's like a lot of learning that can happen, and I've seen it happen very well and successfully, and I've seen it and not so well. So I'd really like to get your thoughts on, you know, how do we discuss difference in a public space, and then how do we discuss it within the context of this smaller, more intimate space of the workshop? Anybody want to start? Let's go with
I'm here now, so you start.
Wanda.
I think that it's important to, and I always encourage people to not be afraid to ask hard questions, and in asking those hard questions of each other, doing that in a way that's investigative and not accusatory or not disrespectful. And for me, I welcome when people ask me questions about myself or something. If it's just that you just don't know, what do I call you? Like, people want to be PC all the time, politically correct, and I don't necessarily I don't call myself African Canadian. I just call myself Black, because I don't feel like I have to attach myself to where Black people came from, although I'm proud of that, but I don't want someone else to tell me what I need to call myself. So when people ask hard questions, that opens up a conversation for us to all learn about each other, and I always encourage that. The thing that I feel in this kind of space is that you can't go in pretending that you already have an idea about something or someone and not be afraid to, because you'll just think that if you never ask the person or never do the homework to find out, you always just think that. And the idea is to try to challenge our thinking and to try to switch our thinking so that we're being open to everybody. And I'm kind of going off on tangent, so I'm going to let other people kind of jump in on that.
Cooper?
I think it's really tricky because as an instructor, as a teacher, for me, I feel like it's incumbent upon me to facilitate through those scenarios. And I'm always worried about how do I educate this person, most likely from a dominant cultural location or social location, without it being at the expense of a marginalized person in the room, right? And so I find it really tricky. And you know, if there's a way to sort of facilitate it where instead of doglegging the entire workshop to educate this one person about something that they should be figuring out on their own, saying like, you know, let's bookmark that and I'll talk to you about it after, or is there a way to address it in the moment that's not putting the labor on people of color in the room, for example, or you know, a disabled person to have to educate, or to expose them to further harm. You know, it's really tricky. and so I think, you know, when I think about like working with undergrads, I've found where people from dominant cultures often want to explain the entire racial epithet or something that they heard, that they are trying to process through, that they don't agree with, but they want to put those words back into the room. And I'll just be like, zip, like, I'm going to stop you right there. You don't need to say it. We've all heard those words, and we're not going to put those words in this room right now. But then, like, how do you unpack it, right? You know, and it's tricky. And I think, you know, kind of keeping things focused on like what's on the page, what are we writing, you know, how are those portrayals or whatever it is that's bringing up the conversation, how is that being portrayed, how can we unpack it, how can we do that? As a white person, I find it, you know, it's my job to, I feel like, to interrupt, especially like racist or biased language. But yeah, I still think it's very situational, and I don't have all the answers. I've been more successful at facilitating that than other times where I feel like I had to kind of maybe after the fact check in with students, you know, whether they're potentially harmed by what was said or need to do some growing.
Yeah, I think you're right, Wanda and Cooper. Norms come into the room with us, and they have to do with ableism and body image, views on race and ethnicity, ageism, all these kinds of things, norms about mental health, neurodiversity. All these things kind of creep into the room with us, and in some ways we can begin to address it a little bit. When I have seen it work well, say someone's offended. They kind of, when it works very well, I've seen a writer or someone in a group or a workshop just bring up their point in a very neutral way. And then they make it, and then hopefully the offender is able to kind of hear it without digging in. But you know, that said, I think it's important to acknowledge that people who are writing from a minority position often have very different experiences in workshop. And I think that's what you were getting at earlier, Ayelet.
Yeah, am I muted? No.
You're good.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like both the things you just said, Wanda and Cooper, resonate with me. It is tricky, and it is case by case, and it changes all the time, and we're not experts. I do come with a fairly structured model that I try to follow. There's certain things that I like to do because I feel like they work. And at times I needed to be more strict about those guidelines, and other times not so much. I totally agree with Wanda about the asking questions. You know, I prefer it when you ask me questions, respectful questions. But I also think that the writers from the dominant group, like you said, Cooper, they should listen and they should not censor themselves. That's a good place to come to the workshop. One of the, I recommended an interview with Ocean Wong, is that how you pronounce his name? And he talks about how he sees the workshop now as an opportunity not to be so prescriptive necessarily, but an opportunity for recognition and a dialogue, you know. And I think about that a lot because I keep remembering the experience I had. You know, and the thing is too, you don't want the experience to mimic the experience these people have outside in the real world, right? And I remember the first time that someone actually wrote next to, on the margin of the first page of a story that I wrote, she said, "It's only the first page and it's already too much." And it immediately mirrored the many times that I felt like I was too much for Canadian society. you know, with my Middle Easternness and my loudness, and it was just the same thing, you know, and it really hurt me, way beyond the critique of my work. So yeah, it's the last thing you want is for you know, writers from marginalized voices to feel further marginalized in the workshop. But it's tricky, and it's a learning process for us as well, for sure.
So what can we do? Wanda, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of say, I think the key is in doing that, like when you're in the moment, and this is why sometimes I think, and I agree with everyone, it's a case by case, but I think in the moment where my mind goes is I'm trying to create allies in the room. And so sometimes I don't want to save that for later. I want to deal with that in the moment with parameters around that, because we need people to become allies of the minority writers in the room. And so I think it's important that we allow people to have that dialogue and that conversation where people can talk about what they thought or what they felt, or maybe what their bias was, or why they said the thing they said and didn't know that it was offensive, or, you know, and at the same time, I agree with Cooper of not wanting to make that minority person in the room be the educator of everybody. But I feel like as a minority person who's been in that situation more times than I care to count, I feel like the times when that worked best was when I was able to express my offensiveness or why that was, or a bit about myself, and I walk away from the room feeling like, okay, now these people understand, or now they get me, and then the next time I walk in that room, I feel them in a different way. So I kind of come at it from that. There's times, of course, when that is not going to work because it's just too heated and you have to let people, you know, cool off and bring it back later, as Cooper said. But at the end of the day, I'm always trying to say, is this an opportunity for me to create some allies in the room for the minority writers? So.
Cooper, any last thoughts?
Yeah, thank you for that, Wanda. And I think too that a thing that's helped me is to also remember that if I didn't facilitate it the way that I exactly wanted it to go in a moment, that I could always bring it up later. You know what I mean? I've done it in terms of my own teaching, where I feel like I didn't do enough to contextualize something, a text that I taught, and then students maybe had a certain reaction to it, and like, why are we reading this triggering piece? And I'm like, oh, you know, the next day, the next class, I come back and say, I owe you an apology. I didn't do enough to contextualize why I asked you to read this piece. So it's like a living relationship. Like Wanda, I think you're speaking to that idea of it's an ongoing relationship. And I do think that trust to build is really, really important, because people need to feel, I think safe is kind of is too solid of a word, but that they need to feel like their work is being respected and that people are coming to it seeing what they're trying to do, rather than force it into a shape from some external perspective of like what a piece of writing should be. And I really love what you said, Wanda, about building allies, because the relationships that students build in an MFA program can last well beyond the program, right? And those relationships are so crucial to us as writers. And to have somebody leave a workshop feeling like not only was their work torn up and misunderstood, but that they don't have those relationships, that they don't have that trust, is really, really damaging, you know, really harmful. So I think really kind of, I like what Ayelet said too about like structure, and, you know, kind of front loading that in the workshop too, of creating structure and creating some norms for the group too, of like, this is how we engage with each other, I think is super helpful. Because one beautiful thing about the King's program is that people are coming from all walks of life. There's a lot of older people who've like lived these entire lives, and there's a lot of experience coming in, but there's a lot of difference. There's not a sort of, there's so kind of getting everybody on the same page of like, these are the ways that we're going to speak to each other. These are the ways that we're going to engage with each other's work. And then always being able to go back to those norms that we've set as a group, I think can be helpful.
I think those are really wonderful points, you know, like I don't think anybody would want to be in a program where everybody was all the same. It's like a little bit dangerous to kind of have these discussions, but I think it makes us all really grow as writers. I think we could probably talk about this all day, but we are sort of running out of a little bit of time now. I wanted to just end on the kinds of things that we can work on and that we can do in order to expand our horizons in this department. So from what we have all talked about today, we can begin to learn to recognize our own biases. We can learn to acknowledge our own subjective positions on the page, and yes, possibly in real life as well. We can learn to be allies. And lastly, we can do some homework. Does anyone have anything else they'd like to add to that list?
Yeah, so listen and don't censor yourself when you're in a workshop situation. Yeah.
And I would like to add to that, come from a place of mutual respect of one another, of one another's work, of one another's experiences, and of what each other brings to the table.
Cooper?
One of my mentors, Sarah Schulman, says that entertainment tells us what we already know, and art teaches us what we don't yet know. And so that idea too of like that we're coming to the creative process to not tell everybody what they already know, but to help, you know, kind of open up different ways of seeing the world. It's not just about the work we put out there, but it's about how we're transformed through the work ourselves. And so, yeah, to just keep an open mind and have curiosity and compassion, I think is really important.
Thank you. So on the topic of homework, we have assembled this massive reading list for you. And of course, it's not all required, but it's just there for you to save and dip into as time rolls along if you're curious. And then one other thing to mention, we do have a couple of live discussion sessions. I believe there is one on Sunday, June the 7th. And then all four of us will be at the Q&A on Friday, June 12th as well. Okay, so we're right about in an hour. Thanks everybody for your eyeballs and attention, and my wonderful co-panelists. Yeah, thank you, and we'll see you at residency.
Thank you, Charlotte.